The forest has a way of swallowing its secrets, tucking them beneath moss, roots, and rot until only whispers remain. But on the outskirts of the Ozark Hills, where fog clings low and the trees grow older than memory, some secrets refuse to stay buried. Locals still speak of the woman who lived alone in the cabin by Black Hollow Creek, a figure so feared and pitted that few dared to utter her name aloud. They called her Mother Gray, a matriarch of bloodlines twisted too tightly, a shadow in a place where even the birds forgot to sing. When a group of hikers stumbled upon her cabin decades after it was left to decay, they thought they'd found nothing more than a relic of time. But what they uncovered inside, a journal stained by weather and tears, told a story that no one was prepared to believe. Scrawled in a trembling hand were confessions so grotesque, so unnatural, that even seasoned investigators hesitated to read them aloud. It spoke of love turned monstrous, of generations entangled until identity itself began to dissolve. The pages revealed a woman who had broken every boundary set by nature and morality alike, a woman who carried in her womb the child of her own grandson. What began as a tale of isolation had become something darker, something festering at the roots of a bloodline that refused to die. The forest around her cabin seemed to pulse with her memory, as if the very ground was breathing her sin. And though her story should have ended long ago, the woods still whisper her name when the wind moves just right, reminding those who listen that some legacies are born not of love, but of curses that never let go. The cabin sat deep in the heart of the Ozark woods, where even sunlight hesitated to intrude. The air grew colder the closer one walked, the soil turning soft beneath the boots of those who dared venture near. Locals had always said the forest there was wrong, that it hummed faintly at night like something alive beneath the ground. It was here, after decades of silence, that a group of hikers stumbled upon the remains of a house that had long been erased from the maps. Half swallowed by vines and time, the wooden structure leaned precariously, its roof caved in, its windows clouded with grime so thick they reflected no light. A single rocking chair sat on what remained of the porch, creaking softly though no wind moved. At first, the group thought it was just another abandoned homestead, one of many left behind when the families of the hills had moved on. But there was something about this place that felt preserved rather than forgotten. The door, though warped, still clung tightly to its hinges, as if protecting whatever secrets lingered inside. The smell that met them as they forced it open was not the usual scent of decay but something metallic, almost sweet, like old blood soaked deep into the wood. Dust floated in narrow shafts of dim light, and the air felt heavy, as though the cabin itself was holding its breath. Inside, the remains of a life once lived were scattered across the floor, a rusted kettle, a child's shoe, a porcelain doll missing one eye. Every corner seemed to echo with an absence that felt deliberate. Strange markings covered one of the walls, carved crudely into the planks, symbols, initials, and dates that looked more like a record than decoration. One hiker found a Bible on a small wooden table, its cover half-burned, its pages brittle and spotted with moisture. Between two of the pages was a lock of gray hair tied with a ribbon so old it crumbled at the touch. When they moved toward the back room, they found a trunk wedged beneath a collapsed beam. Its metal clasp was corroded but intact, as though it had resisted both time and nature. The hikers pried it open, expecting perhaps tools or clothes, but instead found what looked like a bundle of fabric, old quilts wrapped around something solid. Beneath those layers lay the journal that would change everything. The first page bore no name, only a date scrawled in fading ink from the early 1950s and a few words that sent a shiver through every spine in that room. The handwriting was shaky but deliberate, as if written by a trembling hand that still knew it was being watched. The journal was small enough to fit in the palm of a hand, its leather cover darkened with time and moisture, the edges eaten away by insects. When the hikers first lifted it from the trunk, a faint scent of mildew and smoke escaped, as though it had absorbed every breath the cabin had exhaled through the years. Its pages were fragile, yellowed and soft, sticking together in places where dampness had once soaked through. They opened it carefully, afraid that even the weight of their curiosity might cause it to crumble. What they found inside was not the record of an ordinary life but the unraveling of a mind tethered to something unspeakable. The first pages were simple entries, weather notes, the movement of animals, the loneliness of long winters. Yet even in those early lines, there was an unease creeping through the words. Phrases trailed off mid-sentence, ink blotches bled across margins as though written in a trembling hand. Then came the drawings, strange, unsteady sketches of faces with no eyes, family trees branching into circles, initials looping back into themselves. Names repeated over and over, connected by arrows and crosses, until the reader could no longer tell who was who. It was as if the author was trying to map a bloodline that refused to end, one where every generation folded into the next. Further in, the tone shifted from loneliness to obsession. The writer began referring to people not as family but as extensions, describing them in ways that blurred the line between kinship and possession. There were notes about a child who was never to be named, about sins made pure through secrecy, and repeated mentions of something called the lineage pact. Between the inked words were stains that looked almost like fingerprints, pressed deep into the paper, as if someone had clutched the journal with trembling, desperate hands. The final pages of the first half contained drawings that disturbed even the most skeptical among the group. One depicted a small cabin surrounded by towering trees, nearly identical to the one they stood in, and beside it, a woman with long hair drawn in red pencil, holding what looked like a swaddled infant. Beneath the image, the writer had scrawled a sentence that no one could forget, asterisk, "The child of my blood will carry me beyond death." Asterisk, that single line changed the tone of their discovery from curiosity to dread. It was no longer just a diary, it was a confession preserved by the forest itself, a message left behind by someone who believed her story would outlive her, no matter how deeply it was buried in the woods. The journal's contents led the group to search for any record of the people whose names appeared again and again in its pages. Among the names was one that seemed to appear more frequently than the rest, a boy called Samuel, written with an almost affectionate precision. The entry spoke of him as the chosen one, the continuation, and in later pages, the lost blood. Those phrases lingered in the hikers' minds long after they left the cabin, enough to send one of them digging into old police archives in the nearby county. What they uncovered was a forgotten case file, yellowed and brittle, dated back to 1953. It documented the disappearance of a young boy, age 10, last seen walking along the trail that cut through the forest toward the very area where the cabin stood. His name was Samuel Harper. The file was thin, disturbingly so for a missing child case. There were only a few brief reports, statements from neighbors who recalled seeing the boy playing by the creek, a search notice tacked to a church bulletin board, and a short note from the sheriff at the time stating, "Presumed lost in the woods." No remains found. The report abruptly ended there, no follow-up investigation, no mention of foul play. Yet what caught their attention most was a small detail scribbled in the margin by an officer whose handwriting had begun to fade. Asterisk, "The grandmother refuses to speak." Asterisk, no name was listed beside that line, but the hikers couldn't help noticing how that word, grandmother, connected directly to the figure described in the journal. When they compared the estimated location of the boy's disappearance with the coordinates of the cabin, the 2 points nearly overlapped. It was as if the missing child had walked straight into the woods and vanished into her care, or her curse. Some of the older townspeople remembered whispers from that time. They said a woman lived deep in those hills, one who kept to herself, who was often seen talking to no one as she walked the edge of the woods. When the boy disappeared, she stopped being seen entirely. No one dared to question it aloud back then. In a place where family bloodlines ran deep and secrets deeper, people learned to let ghosts lie. But the resurfacing of the journal pulled those buried whispers back into the light. The connection between Samuel Harper and the cabin was no longer a coincidence, it was evidence of a story that had been intentionally erased. The missing child was not simply lost in the forest. He had been absorbed into it, his name etched into the pages of a diary that seemed to have been written not just by a woman, but by something that refused to let its bloodline die. When the journal's contents were turned over to local historians and genealogists, they began piecing together the names scrawled across its fragile pages. What emerged was something far more unsettling than a list of ancestors, it was a maze of relations that defied reason. The handwriting, though erratic, revealed generations that seemed to loop endlessly upon themselves, as if time and lineage had folded together until no one could distinguish mother from daughter, father from son. Each attempt to map the family revealed connections that grew more disturbing the further they went. Cousins were married to cousins, siblings to siblings, uncles to nieces, and in one impossible instance, a grandmother and grandson were recorded as husband and wife. The records from county archives corroborated some of these names, though often under slightly different spellings, as if someone had tried to alter them over the years to hide the truth. Birth certificates had been forged, dates shifted, and parental lines intentionally obscured. Yet the blood ties remained undeniable. It became clear that the family had isolated itself in those woods for generations, living and dying within a single enclosed circle. No outsiders married in, and none of their children ever left. The forest was both their sanctuary and their prison. Those who attempted to map the tree described it as a perfect circle, a symbol of life feeding endlessly on itself, a lineage without fresh blood. The genealogists began noticing strange genetic patterns in the few public medical records that survived. Multiple members of the same bloodline showed identical deformities, unusual facial symmetry, and shared congenital defects. There were rumors of children born without speech, of others whose eyes reflected light like an animal's at night. Each birth seemed to bring them closer to something unnatural, as though their very blood was turning against them. In one census record, the matriarch herself was listed as both mother and grandmother to the same household, a clerical error that would have been easily dismissed, if not for the journal confirming its accuracy. The family's name disappeared from local records entirely after the 1950s, as if the entire bloodline had simply dissolved into the forest. But the map created by the researchers told a different story. It showed that every branch led back to a single woman, the same one who signed her initials throughout the journal's pages. Her name appeared at the base of every line, always written last, always in the same shaky script. It was as if the entire family tree had grown from her and returned to her, a closed loop of flesh and memory bound by her will. And within that loop, the boy named Samuel marked the final generation, the one that would end where it began, inside the walls of that silent cabin in the woods. As the investigation deepened, whispers began to surface among the oldest residents of the nearby town, those who still remembered the stories their parents once told in hushed tones around fireplaces. They spoke of a pregnancy that had shaken the quiet community decades ago, a secret so scandalous that even time itself seemed reluctant to carry it forward. The woman they spoke of was never named directly, only referred to as her, as though saying her name might summon something that still lingered in the woods. The story went that one winter, she had vanished from public view entirely, refusing visitors and shuttering the windows of her cabin. Months later, she reappeared briefly at the edge of town, frail and pale, with a swollen belly hidden beneath layers of worn fabric. No husband was ever seen with her, no explanation ever offered. People guessed, they whispered, they judged, but no one dared to ask. The pregnancy was described as unnatural, not merely because of its mystery but because of the aura of shame and dread that followed her wherever she went. Some claimed she visited the church one evening and begged for forgiveness, though others said the preacher refused to let her in. After that night, she was never seen in town again. Midwives who once served the surrounding families avoided her property entirely, saying they had heard strange sounds drifting through the trees, soft cries that did not sound human. One elderly woman, long since passed, had once confessed to her daughter that she had been summoned to the cabin late one stormy night to assist with a difficult birth. She never gave details, only muttered that what she saw wasn't right and that the child should never have been born. No official records of the birth were ever found. No doctor's notes, no baptism, no burial. Yet the journal's pages hinted at that same winter, filled with trembling words about new life born from purity of blood, and the cycle completed. The woman wrote of pain mingled with joy, of fear overshadowed by devotion, as if the act itself had been part of some sacred family ritual. The final entry from that time mentioned the sound of a baby crying in the cold and a promise that the forest will keep what belongs to it. The townsfolk remembered that the lights in her cabin burned for 3 nights after the storm, flickering through the trees like watchful eyes. Then, on the 4th night, they went dark and never returned. No one ventured out to check, not even the sheriff. It was easier to let the woods claim her secret than to face what they suspected was true, that the child she bore was not a miracle but a manifestation of the family's darkest sin. Years after the rumors of the forbidden pregnancy had faded into folklore, a letter was discovered inside the false bottom of an old sewing chest found in the attic of a crumbling farmhouse just outside the forest's edge. It was brittle and stained, written in fading brown ink that bled at the edges, its folds creased so tightly it had nearly become part of the wood beneath it. The handwriting was elegant but hurried, the words pressed deep into the paper as if written by trembling hands. At the bottom of the letter was the name of a woman known only to a few surviving locals, a midwife named Clara Bell, who had served the rural families of the Ozarks during the 1940s and 50s. She had vanished mysteriously in 1954, leaving behind her home, her tools, and now, this confession. The letter began like a prayer. Clara addressed no one in particular, only, to those who find this, may you forgive my silence. She wrote that she had been summoned one night in the dead of winter to assist with a delivery deep in the woods, guided by a man's voice that refused to tell her his name. The path had been treacherous, the snow thick, and the air filled with a silence she described as too alive to be empty. When she reached the cabin, she was met by a woman lying pale and exhausted on a blood-stained quilt, her eyes glassy but aware. There was no husband present, no family, only the woman's whispered pleas that the child be born pure and untainted. Clara's words grew increasingly frantic as she described the delivery, how the mother wept, not from pain but from something that felt like devotion, how she kept repeating that the child was hers and yet not hers. The letter grew darker as it neared its end. Clara wrote that when the baby finally arrived, she hesitated to touch it. There was something about the infant's face that froze her where she knelt, some resemblance that felt too close, too cyclical, as though she were staring at a mirror distorted by generations. The mother took the child in her arms and began to hum a lullaby so low that Clara thought it came from the earth itself. She was told to leave immediately and to never speak of what she had seen, for the blood must remain closed. The final lines were shaky and uneven, written as if the ink itself had been pulled by trembling fear. Clara confessed that she left the cabin but could still hear the crying long after she returned home, echoing through the trees as though the woods themselves were alive with the sound of that cursed birth. When forensic teams were finally brought in decades later, the investigators believed they were simply closing an old cold case. The discovery of bones near the ruins of the cabin had prompted an excavation, one that began as routine but soon spiraled into something that unsettled even the most hardened professionals. The remains were fragile, fragmented, and partially fused into the soil, suggesting they had lain there for more than half a century. What stood out immediately was the strange composition of the skeletal fragments. There were inconsistencies in size and bone density, features that didn't align with any single age group. Some bones belonged to a child, others to an adult, and yet several were too malformed to categorize at all. It was as if nature itself had struggled to define what it had created. Samples were taken to the state laboratory for DNA analysis, the team expecting to find some trace of a family connection that could finally identify the victims. When the results came back, silence filled the room. The genetic markers revealed something that none of the scientists could easily explain. The DNA sequences showed almost no diversity, indicating generations of inbreeding far beyond what was biologically sustainable. The genetic mutations present were so severe that one expert described them as the kind you'd expect in laboratory experiments, not human families. Several strands were identical, indistinguishable from one another, as though the same blood had been recycled through time without interruption. The report noted abnormalities in the mitochondrial DNA, traits that could only occur when offspring were produced between individuals who shared an unusually high percentage of identical genetic material. These patterns were unlike anything documented in regional genealogy studies. It was later determined that the remains belonged to members of the same direct bloodline that appeared in the recovered journal, confirming every rumor the townsfolk had tried for decades to dismiss. But what disturbed the investigators most wasn't only the DNA, it was the evidence of deliberate concealment. The bodies hadn't been buried with care or ceremony. They were layered, positioned almost ritualistically beneath the cabin's foundation, as though intended to become part of the structure itself. Bits of fabric, locks of hair, and even children's toys were found interwoven with the remains, suggesting that whoever placed them there hadn't viewed them as dead but as preserved. The team's lead geneticist, who had handled countless cold cases, later refused to speak publicly about the findings. In his private notes, discovered years later, he wrote a single line that investigators never released to the press: this bloodline wasn't born of evolution, it was born of obsession. The cabin had not been a home but a shrine, built over the remains of a family that had turned its own existence into an experiment in isolation. Long after the forensic teams packed up their equipment and the official reports were sealed, a group of amateur investigators returned to the site, drawn by the story's eerie reputation. They called themselves truth seekers, equipped with modern recording devices and motion sensors, determined to document what they believed was more than a tale of human depravity. They arrived just before dusk, when the forest around the old foundation of the cabin seemed to shift in temperament, the air thickening with a chill that felt unnatural for summer. They set up their cameras in a circle around what had once been the living room, now nothing more than a patch of disturbed soil surrounded by skeletal beams. As night fell, the woods came alive, not with the expected sounds of insects or distant animals, but with an uneasy stillness that made every breath feel intrusive. The first few hours passed in silence until, shortly after midnight, one of the investigators reported hearing what sounded like a woman humming. The sound was faint, almost soothing, and seemed to drift from somewhere beyond the tree line. They assumed it was the wind at first, but when the recordings were later reviewed, the audio revealed something stranger. The voice was distinct, melodic yet fractured, carrying an old lullaby that none of them recognized. Beneath it, barely audible, were other sounds, whispers, overlapping as though several voices were speaking at once. The more they listened, the clearer one phrase became, "Keep the blood pure." They continued recording through the night, and at 3:12 a.m., one of the motion sensors triggered near the remains of the cabin's foundation. The camera facing that direction flickered, static washing across the screen before focusing on what appeared to be movement. A faint figure, shrouded, stooped, and indistinct, seemed to glide through the darkness. The figure paused where the front door once stood, its outline trembling as if caught between presence and absence, and then it vanished. Immediately after, the temperature sensors dropped by nearly 15 degrees, and all audio devices picked up a single sharp cry that sounded unmistakably like a newborn's wail. When morning came, they reviewed the footage again, expecting some trick of shadow or interference. But the humming returned on every recording, layered with the sound of footsteps crunching leaves, though none of the team had moved during that time. The investigators left before noon, shaken, unwilling to stay another night. Months later, one of them mailed the recordings anonymously to a local radio host who specialized in unsolved mysteries. The host played the clip live, and thousands of listeners heard the same thing the team had, an old woman singing softly through the static, her voice fading into the faint cry of a baby that refused to die away. The excavation of the cabin's ruins had already yielded bones and fragments of the past, but it wasn't until they began removing the warped floorboards that they uncovered the most haunting evidence of all. Beneath the decayed planks, the soil had been deliberately disturbed, compacted, and layered with ash. At first, the investigators assumed it was the remains of a fire pit or perhaps a makeshift cellar, but as they dug deeper, the outline of a small wooden box began to emerge. The wood was blackened with rot yet still held its shape, bound with strips of rusted iron. The moment they lifted it, a faint scent escaped, old earth mixed with something faintly floral, like wilted lilacs. It took only one glance to recognize that it was a coffin, small enough to hold an infant. The box was brought carefully to a nearby facility for examination, where experts worked to preserve every piece. When the lid was finally pried open, silence filled the room. Inside lay a bundle wrapped in faded quilts, their fabric discolored but still patterned with faint blue stitching. The initials embroidered into the corner of one blanket matched those found throughout the recovered journal. The fabric had fused to what remained of the body inside, a tiny skeleton curled as if asleep. But what unsettled the forensic team was not just the size of the remains, but what surrounded them. Tucked alongside the child were trinkets and tokens, a cracked locket containing a lock of gray hair, a tiny wooden cross carved crudely by hand, and several glass marbles, each one painted with an identical symbol resembling an infinity loop. The preservation of the remains was unusually precise for such an isolated burial. There were traces of salt and herbs packed into the quilts, substances historically used to slow decomposition. It was as though whoever buried the child had wanted it to remain untouched by time. The journal entries that corresponded to the same period hinted at a child born perfect, pure, and eternal, suggesting that this infant was no ordinary birth but a symbol, perhaps even an offering meant to preserve the bloodline cycle. When the coffin was tested for DNA, the results confirmed the deepest fears of those studying the case. The infant carried the same genetic markers as both the supposed grandmother and her grandson, making it the literal embodiment of the family's corruption. The quilt stitching, the same initials, the symbols, all of it tied back to the woman who had written the final confession in the journal. It became clear that the coffin was not a grave but a monument, a deliberate preservation of a child never meant for the outside world. In that moment, the cabin stopped being a ruin and became something far darker, a tomb built to protect the secret of a lineage that refused to let itself die. The final revelation came not from the excavation or the scientific reports but from the last few pages of the journal itself, written in ink so faded it could barely be read without magnification. The handwriting was uneven, trembling, the words trailing off as if the author's strength was failing with every sentence. Those who read it said it felt less like a confession and more like the unraveling of a mind that had been haunted by its own creation. The matriarch wrote of voices that came to her in sleep, whispering from the trees outside the cabin, urging her to complete what she had begun. She spoke of her family not as people but as roots twisting through the soil, feeding on each other to stay alive. The forest, she claimed, was their witness and their keeper. She described Samuel, her grandson, as the final vessel, the one who would bring the circle to completion. The words implied not love but purpose, a ritualistic obsession that blurred the lines between survival and sin. "We are not cursed," she wrote, "we are chosen to keep the blood unbroken." The pages that followed grew more erratic, filled with scratches and blotches of ink that resembled more artwork than writing. Some phrases were repeated over and over, as if she were trying to convince herself of their truth. He is mine, I am his, and the forest keeps us both. It was in the final entry that her story reached its most horrifying point. She confessed that she was carrying a child once more, conceived by her own grandson, the same boy whose disappearance had haunted the town for years. She claimed it was not an act of lust or madness but destiny, the ultimate preservation of their lineage. Her words described the night she fled deeper into the forest, leaving behind her home, her possessions, and the remains of those who had come before her. She wrote of hearing the baby cry within her even before it was born, of feeling its heartbeat sync with her own until she could no longer tell where her life ended and the child's began. The last lines were written in large, jagged strokes across the page: "The forest will hide us. The blood will continue. No one will remember, but the earth will." After that, the journal ended abruptly. No signature, no closing thought. Only a final smudge of ink that looked disturbingly like the imprint of a hand dragged downward, as though she had tried to keep writing but was pulled away before she could finish. When investigators held the journal to the light, faint fingerprints appeared on the final page, smaller ones layered over her own, as if another set of hands, much younger, had pressed against hers while she wrote.